The success we've seen has been so insane. You know?
It's the most played game on Steam now.
Right,
officially.
like by quite a large margin now, which is...
And concurrent players in the millions. I've never seen anything. It just smashed.
We're going to hit, I think, 3 million concurrents today.
Send a massive thank you to everyone who's played, who creates content, or who has otherwise supported the game over the past year. You know, it's really been a crazy ride for us, and we look forward to many more years playing together with you guys.
The Battle Royale genre as we know it is by no means a new thing anymore. The last 5 years or so of gaming have been nothing but that in some sense. But what happened to Patient Zero? What happened to the game that can really be credited for kicking that whole trend off? PUBG truly is the grandfather of the Battle Royale genre. While other games existed prior to this, you know, H1Z1, DayZ, or Arma mods, etc., it wouldn't be until 2017 where Battle Royale really began to find its footing with the general audience, and specifically, Brendan Green's take on a game made specifically with Battle Royale in mind. PUBG, I think, can be largely credited for changing the direction of gaming in our modern day. However, something strange has occurred with this game in particular. PUBG doesn't seem to have a seat at the table of mainstay BR games anymore, or not in the way at least that it used to. Fortnite, Apex, and Warzone are essentially the big three now, and PUBG sits far beneath these games in terms of relevancy in 2022, but at one point in time, PUBG was the most popular game in the entire world. But how did it fall so far from that point? As someone who was completely in love with this game, I'm deeply familiar with how PUBG handled itself over the years, and the reason for its sharp decline compared to other games revealed itself to me as crystal clear. This was a game at one point had the whole world in a chokehold, mesmerizing even the most cynical of gamers, to now, where it's fallen so far out of touch with what made it special to begin with, where it's become a shell of the game that it used to be. This video is a bit of a tough one for me to make because of how deeply in love I was with PUBG, and it's even more heartbreaking to see a once great titan in the gaming industry become a mere shell of its former self. So what happened exactly? Well, let's take this all the way back to our humble beginnings with Brendan Green and where his idea for the game was born.
Okay, let me see if this game works. Let's see if it's up. What's this game called? PlayerUnknownBattlegrounds. Alright, let's try this. Let's try this game. Let's give it a whirl.
Brendan Green was practically the sole mastermind behind PUBG as we know it. In fact, it's called PlayerUnknownsBattlegrounds as Brendan Green was PlayerUnknown himself. He was a man quite in love with video games and mods, and in particular, he loved Arma 3 and mods that made death feel impactful. In other words, Brendan loved the high-stakes feeling in his gameplay, contrasting it to other FPS games where you just die and respawn constantly without any real consequence. He wanted to make a game where death felt punishing and victory unbelievably sweet. After modding his idea into other games, he eventually decided to make his own proper version of it. This small indie game called PlayerUnknownsBattlegrounds would begin to be developed. Bluehole, a small company at the time, was tasked with helping to build this game that Brendan Green had envisioned. Now, initially, PUBG took heavy inspiration from Arma when it came to its difficult and semi-realistic gunplay. It's one of the core defining features of Battlegrounds now, and then the survival elements of H1Z1 or DayZ. While PUBG is really considered to be primarily a shooter battle royale game now, that wasn't always the case. It started as more of a survival focused game, which might seem like a small detail, but that will be important in the downfall later on. The point is, however, Brendan still had full creative control in terms of how the game would develop and evolve going forward. 2016 had a few small tests, and a select number of people would be able to play this new and strange game Brendan had been developing, but 1 year later, finally, PUBG would release on Steam and to the entire world on March 23rd, 2017. The first month of the game was good, but wasn't anything, necessarily out of the ordinary, having less than 70,000 peak players over the course of March into April, but the months following would be a totally different story. PUBG began to take the world by storm over the following months, growing to millions of concurrent players worldwide, eventually peaking at over 3 million active users playing at the same time. How did all of that happen? PUBG had the most effective form of marketing ever. This game spread like wildfire through word of mouth like never seen before. Friends were recommending it to each other, and the nature of the game was so addicting it could not be ignored. Not to mention the attention on Twitch and YouTube the game was beginning to receive. But ask yourself this, Why was PUBG addicting? Maybe you've never really given it much thought before, but I think I can tell you exactly why. Firstly, as being a battle royale, the format works directly on our physiology. The anticipation of winning a game was the most addicting and dopamine-fueled gaming experience up to that point. This is true of every BR. The anticipation of reward is actually the feeling people like so much, and PUBG holds you in that anticipatory state for so long to hook you, and then as soon as you win, you'll be chasing that feeling again and again, unable to put it down. And secondly, this is PUBG specific, but I always thought this game was special because of its unique pacing. In the more recent BRs, Warzone, Apex, Fortnite, and so on, the action is far more consistent. This leads many people to say that PUBG is too boring and too slow, and while I understand why one would say that, it's the attribute that makes it unique, and personally speaking, the action in PUBG is far more adrenaline pumping than any other BR I just mentioned by a long shot, because it happens way less frequently, but much more intensely.
Yeah, I don't see myself leaving PUBG ever. That's why I don't think I could swap to Fortnite like everyone's doing. Like, Fortnite's a good game, but it just doesn't have that same feeling when you're fragging, you know?
There's an old saying that goes something along the lines of, a soldier's life is 99% peace and 1% sheer terror. And that's basically the essence that PUBG captured specifically. You had a mostly slow and methodical game of looting and prepping and short bursts of complete adrenaline with high stakes on the line. This is what made the game enjoyable to watch too, with plenty of big streamers taking a liking to the game. And for the audience, it's a great viewing experience because each match was a story. You watch the narrative of the player from start to finish, how they begin, how they overcome obstacles, and eventually come up short or win it all.
Got a sniper. And just like that, ladies and gentlemen, first game of the day, first game of the year, and what do we do, ladies and gentlemen?
And as a viewer, you just couldn't look away from that story. It was gripping, and the game had such a unique feel to it. The gunplay is one of the most defining and satisfying features of probably any video game ever. The gunplay in PUBG was always extremely special. Also, the main map, called Erangel, named after Brendan Green's daughter, Erin, is the core identifier for PUBG in my opinion. It's the most recognizable part of this game by far, and with the fun weapon selection and sandbox items, the potential for player interaction through proximity chat and so on, this game had everything it needed to be massively appealing and successful, and there was absolutely nothing quite like this gaming experience at the time. And classic PUBG are probably some of my biggest highlights of my entire gaming experience, period. And I'm sure the case was the same for many of you as well. You can clearly see this entire perfect storm. It completely worked. This small little indie game with a strange name began to take the spotlight. PUBG even surpassed the extremely popular League of Legends on Twitch for a period of time. And when you consider all of this, in 2017, PUBG pretty much ruled the world. These were the glory days for Battlegrounds, and its time in the sun would last from March 2017 when it launched up until about December of that year. And this seemed like an absolute behemoth of a game that was literally too big to fail. But it wouldn't be until 2018 that some cracks in the armor began to appear, and the first signs of decline would begin to make themselves known.
That's Battlegrounds right there, man. I'm done with the game. I'm good.
You're having to wait. Dude, the servers... I can't play this game! I can't. Server's broken. Oh! I'm not playing this. This is fucking stupid. I don't even care.
After the honeymoon phase of PUBG began to wear off, the first issues plaguing the game would start to become obvious. The severity of these issues varied to some degree, but the main unavoidable ones were the extremely poor technical optimization and cheaters, because Brendan had built the foundations of this game with the prior experience he had, and being unable to anticipate just how well the game was going to perform, the game is built on a somewhat shoddy foundation.
Oh, it's a speed hacker. Look at this dude. What the f is that?
And to repair many of the optimization and crashing issues facing the game, it would pretty much mean the entire game would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, which just isn't feasible. And not to mention, the cheating epidemic in this game was borderline comical. All games have cheaters and hackers to some extent, but PUBG's identity practically became known for being the game full of cheaters. Because of its less polished build and nature, it was extremely easy for cheaters to develop programs and even harder for PUBG to find, detect, and get rid of them. 2018 was the year where PUBG began to see a decline in player counts for the first time in its life cycle. It started to hemorrhage more and more users each month, which also included a sharp decline in overall interest in the game. At the same time, a more optimized, less hacked, and more accessible, and not to mention free Fortnite was beginning to overtake PUBG's general player base. Keep in mind, PUBG saw all this success despite being a paid game. It wasn't free to play, yet still reached these insane player counts. But why would anyone in 2018 look at a poorly optimized paid game and play that when they could play a more optimized and free one? This is where I think one of the first massive mistakes PUBG made could have been avoided. Maybe it would have made sense to go free to play shortly after seeing the success that Fortnite was having with its model, but of course that would hurt short-term profits and stuck to keeping it a paid experience. And while these factors were making the game a challenge to play at times, by all accounts, PUBG's core gameplay was still super fun, content was being added at a reasonable pace, a new map called Miramar was released, it came with new weapons, etc. It still had a pretty healthy player count at the end of 2018, all things considered. 2018 was a rough year for PUBG, but it would be nothing compared to what took place the following year. 2019 was the year where I think everything changed for PUBG. It was a fork in the road. When you think about other battle royale games, including Fortnite, all of these see natural declines in interest over time, and the player base diminishes to some extent no matter what. But PUBG did something quite strange. It began leveraging short-term thinking techniques to get players back in the door, but this came at the cost of the longevity of the game. Sometime in 2019, Brendan Green stepped down from the creative lead position at PUBG.
We always talked about what I wanted to do next, but last year I kind of told him, listen, I wanted to be closer to my daughter. I'd spend essentially 3 years kind of away from Ireland, and it was tough, having to only see her maybe a few months out of the year total. So this is for some new ideas. Listen, I've done battle royale in many forms.
Yeah.
This is now something new. This is other games I want to play. PUBG is PUBG, right? I mean, I don't want the next game to be PUBG 2. It's like I don't see that as a way to go forward. Listen, PUBG is my vision for a battle royale game. That's done in my mind. Next is something else.
He announced that he would no longer be calling the shots and being in charge of the game, and just working on things from the sidelines at PUBG Special Projects. This is the moment where the paradigm shifted. His reasons for leaving were that he basically had no time to spend with his daughter and the rest of his family in Ireland, and that he was more interested in just making new things. He's made Battle Royale, he's done with that and wants to move on to new stuff. While his position of leadership would be passed on to someone extremely qualified, it was inevitably going to mark the start of some major changes. Not only that, but later in the year, talks of the company Krafton buying out Bluehole and PUBG Corp began to take place. Two major shifts took place from these events. Firstly, without Brendan Green in control of how the game feels anymore, PUBG began to make some questionable choices when it came to content. Maps like Sanhok or Vikendi, Brendan Green worked on to some extent and were generally regarded as solid maps. It wouldn't be until ones like Karakin, Haven, Paramo, Taigo, and Destin in the years following that things really began to feel different. Not to mention the extreme lack of communication with the community when it came to fixing the game's poor technical state or talking about how they're combating cheaters. To be fair, the reason they were silent on the cheating front, the more they talk about how they combat cheaters, it gives them an easier time learning how to slip through the system. So that can be tricky business to navigate, and the relative silence is explained there. But still, it felt tone deaf to the community to be pushing like weapon, skin, and store updates when the game still had plenty of glaring flaws. I believe at this point in time, PUBG still had plenty of opportunities to course correct here. Perhaps a bit more transparency with the community might have helped, and making the game more accessible to everyone should have been priority number one, given that new BR games were starting to pop up and it was beginning to have some real serious and fierce competition. With PUBG under completely new management and still having issues that plagued the game since its inception, the future of PUBG was uncertain but not doomed. Player count was nowhere near that it was at its peaks, but it was still quite healthy in the grand scheme of things. But if you ask me, it would be 2020 and 2021 where PUBG would ultimately seal its fate. I shouldn't have to tell you guys this, but 2020 was of course an anomaly year for gaming. Given that everyone was inside, games player counts increasing was almost a guarantee. Initially, PUBG saw a massive spike in player count and overall interest in the game. It had released some new and exciting content like a remaster of the original Erangel map, some new items and modes that really freshened up the experience as well. While at first this seemed to cause a reversal for the trend of the game, that success would be short-lived as the interest rapidly fell back off to levels lower than ever seen before. But what was causing this? Remember how I said earlier that the game initially was a survival-based FPS BR game and that the paradigm had shifted after Brendan's departure? Around this time as well, PUBG would be absorbed and acquired by Krafton. All of these things in combination fundamentally changed the nature of the PUBG experience. Firstly, the survival elements of PUBG were starting to fade away. As the player base naturally began to get better, players became more and more aggressive and seeked out gunfights more. This did very weird things to the dynamic of the game. It was less focused on survival, and because players were more confident, it became more about being a gunfighting badass. And while that can be interesting to watch, it undeniably made the whole experience something different. This heightening skill curve also began to effectively shred away the less hardcore players who felt the game was getting a bit too sweaty. I think almost everyone would agree as PUBG evolved, the core survival element began to fall into the background and people started playing it more like a traditional fast-paced FPS game, and I'm no exception to that either. Also, important to mention, PUBG was built in third-person perspective and a first-person mode was added later on. This is one of PUBG's biggest admitted regrets in hindsight, as this split the player base directly in half. And that problem was compounded by the many different maps in the game that all had a separate queue. On top of that, PUBG also had a ranked and non-ranked mode. With the already dwindling player numbers, all of this division made finding a game nearly impossible. The ability for map selection was removed since queues didn't have enough active players to run every map. The game was fragmenting so quickly that nobody could keep up, and every time the game added a new update with a new map or a mode, it only exacerbated the problem. Also, PUBG was basically the only big BR game at this point without full crossplay. They could have done it, and I personally spoke to many PUBG employees myself about that very topic, but they chose not to for a variety of reasons, most of them quite reasonable. But still, that didn't change the fact that the game was fracturing in a way that was insanely unhealthy, so the overall experience was starting to worsen. And secondly, with the game under new management and being acquired by Krafton, more and more emphasis began to focus on the monetization of the product, selling skins and store items, rather than actually improving the gameplay experience. While over the years PUBG had taken really big steps in dealing with the optimization issues and cheating, it was still light years behind their competition. All the while, Krafton started to treat the brand and the game of PUBG more as a corporate product rather than the fun little indie game that it had began as. And I'm not saying every game under a corporation is automatically scummy or evil. My only point is that there was a clear change in vibe of what PUBG is. It started being treated as this mega brand when it never really set out to be that at all, and that wasn't why people enjoyed it. At this point, PUBG was far from the game it once was, but all hope was not lost just yet, and they still had the ability to hit the big red button, and eventually they would do just that. In January of 2022, PUBG would finally announce they were going free to play, a decision that I think should have been made back as far as 2018, but nonetheless, they were actually doing it. This was the last-ditch effort to restore the game to where it had been standing, and surprisingly, this actually worked. In the first month, it saw a rise in player counts not seen for well over 2 years. Interest was at an all-time high relative to what it had been for the last couple of years or so, but unfortunately, this success wouldn't last forever, as the player count sharply fell off again after the initial release month, coming back down to new lows it had been facing the years prior. PUBG also suffered from the same issue every BR faced with enough time. Slowly but surely, the hardcore players began to cannibalize themselves to where eventually the only people left playing the game still are literal pro players and streamers. PUBG got hit with this exceptionally hard as well, and in 2022, it's an impossibility to find a game of relatively new players or what were considered noobs. Everyone left on the game still is a diehard fan and likely very high skill now, or, literally a pro player. The growth potential of the game in 2022 revealed itself as completely capped out. Currently, it holds steady around its current peaks of around 390k to 430 peak concurrent users, which is still respectable, but isn't even in the same league compared to where it once stood. Since being under new management, the game has seen plenty of updates, new maps, weapons, items, etc., and some of it has been really good. And I'm not somebody who claims PUBG went downhill purely as a result of when Brendan Green left, that the new leadership and devs did many objectively great things for the game. Some things, not so much, but that's just part of the process. But taking a step back, I look at the game now, and I feel it's almost unrecognizable. I don't even know what PUBG is anymore, really. I don't know who this game's target audience is anymore, but it's certainly not me, and it's no longer many of you watching this video, I'm sure. I just watch early PUBG and the humble grittiness of it all and the clear lack of polish, the rawness to it, and I compare it to now where it just feels like a shell of a game that's been gutted to serve an entirely different function now. That said, I still love the core gameplay of PUBG so much still, and I remembered why I fell in love with this game to begin with, but I'd be lying if I told you that it didn't feel like something's missing. What I think made PUBG fall harder than any other BR game was the sacrifice of its identity. It started as this kind of niche and semi-realistic survival FPS game with very grounded and believable aesthetics and mechanics to being pretty much unrecognizable as the same experience as it exists today. It's become more of a vehicle for selling virtual items than an actual video game. Maybe that's me being overly cynical about it, but they've even removed the PlayerUnknown part from their branding. The game is just PUBG Battlegrounds now. It's not even close to the product it was before, and the big streamers it did have pretty much have all put it to rest at this point.
Like I said, PUBG's like kind of fun with the first few games because you're chilling, and then it just woo boy, then it gets not it. All right, I'm out of here.
Roadmap is just like really upsetting, and then this crashing stuff started happening. I'm not gonna spend more time trying to figure out how to play this broken game.
Horrendous. It's a piece of shit game. I hate to say it, Battlegrounds, but the death is imminent. And it's happening fast, man.
I think the decline of PUBG can be sadly but accurately described as such. PUBG turned into what it never wanted to become. A small indie game going against the grain and the rules established at that point in the gaming industry. It went from being a trendsetter to the one following the trends. It went from a clever high-stakes game to a shell of a game as a vehicle for corporate monetization. And the main cause of death was its core identity was unfortunately mangled and lost in the process, leaving us only with our memories of the times when the magic was felt in the air. But to not end on such a depressing note, PUBG is a game that will always have a special place in my heart. Opportunities I've had and friends I've made gave me a career and given me lifelong experiences and memories that wouldn't have happened without it, and I'm eternally grateful for that. While I may not be the most avid player anymore, I'll always be grateful for the opportunity that Brendan Green and the team made to provide this experience and to be part of the magic when it existed.